Good morning, everybody. Dave Evans from SafeDefend Studios here in glorious Guthrie, Oklahoma with Dr. Greg Vecchi, our expert on all things school safety and preparedness. We're going to audible today because Doc had a really good point. We want to talk about how to deal with the casualties before help gets there today. I think this is an important topic, and I think it's an important topic because the reality of what you're going to deal with is really scary. And unless you talk about it and have a plan, it's really scary. The only way to make this not scary is to talk about the reality of what's going to happen if somebody comes into your school and starts pulling the trigger on a firearm or has a knife and stabs somebody. How do you deal with that? So, Doc, let's talk about casualties and what we're seeing in the research as the primary wounds that are being seen at the school when something happens.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a really important topic because I think there's some misconceptions and myths out there, and things are changing, right? I mean, we don't want to keep doing the same thing all the time when the environment is changing, because then we get kind of locked into inefficient, responses and not doing the best we can to protect ourselves and our loved ones and students and everyone else around us in the event that this tragedy happens, where you've got a person coming in with a gun trying to kill everybody. I think we have to go back to the basics of what we talked about at SafeDefend, and the at least in the response area, right? Is this critical time gap, right? And the critical time gap is when between the time when the attack starts and when it ends, and that's your area to survive, and that's what we've talked about at length here on SafeDefend Live and also in our training, and that's the escape and invade and engage and all that stuff. And we've covered that pretty extensively. But here's what's going to happen is there are people who are going to get hurt, and you really can't avoid that, especially if you have someone, an offender who's using a firearm. Knife wounds can be very, very deadly. In fact, if you look at kind of a comparison, there are more people that die from knife wounds overall than from gunshots. Just generally. But we have to take in consideration that we're not talking about active shooters. That's the reason I like to talk about active killers.
Yep.
Because if they can't get a gun, they're going to get a knife. And whatever weapon they use, whether they're going to run you over with a truck in the parking lot, whether you use some sort of an edged weapon like a knife or some sort of a firearm, pistol, rifle, whatever, is that people are going to get hurt. And so we can't really avoid that. But when it happens, you have to be at least prepared and trained to understand what might happen and then what you can do until help arrives. Now, we're not expecting anyone here to be a doctor, a nurse, an EMS person. If you have that training, the first aid training, by all means, get it, get good at it, and things like this. What I'm going to cover today is just kind of a discussion with your input also, Dave.
Yep.
On just for the average person who's going to get, maybe some down and dirty training, and that's going to be it, right? And how do we, survive that time gap until the real EMS, the real medics arrive? And so, as we're looking through some of the stuff that we've talked about previously, is we talk a lot about extremity type wounds. You get an arm or a leg slashed or shot, and you have excessive bleeding. Okay, I want to talk about that first. And so we offer at SafeDefend, and what I would suggest, even if you don't have our equipment, as far as the life safety medical tools, is essentially three major things. One is you want a tourniquet, okay? The next thing you want is some sort of hemostatic gauze. And now that's sometimes called quick clot, sometimes it's called C-locks. There's a lot of different ones you can get. Now as a side, we prefer C-locks because it works in the event you have someone who might be on blood thinners. And that's kind of an advantage over other products such as quick clot and some other ones. And then you want to have gauze or some sort of a pressure bandage, right? And so you have those three things. And really, it's fairly easy. Now, we can talk about triangular bandages, and we can talk about, having gloves and all the other stuff. And it's good to have all that. But when someone is bleeding out, right, especially if you've got like a femoral artery in the leg cut or something like this, and you've got excessive blood, first off, it's not even easy to figure out where the blood is exactly coming from. It's not as easy as it is. It's going to be bleeding. The clothes are going to be soaked, things like this. And in these situations, we don't really have a lot of time to do the textbook things. Put your gloves on, get the scissors out, cut the clothing away from the wound. If it needs a tourniquet, trying to, measure how many fingers above do we put it, and all this other stuff. That's not realistic in an emergency, and it's not realistic for someone who's not trained and does this very often. So I like to kind of break it down into just a couple down and dirty things to remember. Okay, if you have all the other stuff in the training, that's good. But the bottom line is if you have bleeding, the first thing you want to try to do is put pressure on it.
Yep.
Okay, you grab gauze. Okay, or you rip up a t-shirt if you don't have the proper medical gear, and you put it over the where the blood is coming out, and you simply press on it as hard as you can with your hands, like with your palm covered by the other hand, and you put pressure on it and you lean into it. You might have to even put your elbow on it, right? And lean back, get more of an angle on it. You might have to have somebody else come and help you put pressure on it or relieve you after you get tired. But that's the first thing that we try to do. If that doesn't work, then we need to be ready to use that hemostatic gauze. And that's just a matter of what we call packing the wound. And all you're doing is the gauze will come out and you just rip off the squares and literally stuff it into the wound, and stuff it deep and hard into the wound and pack it until it's completely filled up. Then put gauze or t-shirt or whatever you have over it and pressure again. Okay. If it's still bleeding, that's when we need to use the tourniquet. And so obviously we don't put tourniquets below the wound, right? We need to put it above the wound. So if the cut is, or the injury's here, okay, or on my arm here, I guess here, if it's injuries here, I want to go above the wound. But here's the problem. In an emergency situation where you've got blood-soaked clothes and you don't really have time. A lot of times people have the skill to try to figure out, well, where exactly is the bleed coming? It's not necessarily going to be spurting out, and you're going to know exactly where it is and know to go over it. So one of the cheats or hacks that I learned from a couple military guys was that just put the tourniquet as high on the extremity as possible, because even if it's cut here, bleeding here, here, or here, if you put it up here but still under the armpit, still around the extremity, and tighten that, any cut underneath it is going to stop bleeding. Okay, and the same way with your leg. So it eliminates this. Okay, where's the cut? Where's it coming out? And then trying to mess around, trying to get the tourniquet, because if you don't get it just right, then you may not stop the bleed, and that's always a problem. And also the other thing is when you're using a tourniquet, you're stuffing, wounds with the gauze and all this other stuff. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's going to hurt, right? This guy, the person who's injured, is going to be in lots of pain, and you're going to be adding to that pain, right? So you want to make sure to talk to that person, right? Let them know, look, I'm here to help you. Here's what I'm going to do. Okay, you're bleeding. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be okay. Hang in there with me. Okay. Don't look at what I'm doing. Look at me. Okay. And talk to that person and let them know that, look, I'm going to be putting this tourniquet. I'm going to turn this tourniquet. I'm going to be putting pressure on, and it's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt a lot. And I want you to know that, right? So they can be prepped, because if they're just sitting around and you're working on them and you're not talking to them. Part of this is, trying to get them psychological first aid also, is to let them know that, look, I'm hurt, but I got somebody trying to help me. Yep. And you're calming them and things like that. That's typically what is taught out there. I kind of like the additional things of thinking about putting the tourniquet as high on the extremity as possible, or on the leg, so you don't have to sit there and try to guess where that blood's coming out, because a lot of times you got clothes and the blood is coming out, and the clothes is holding the pulse down, and it's just saturating and kind of coming all over the place, and you don't really know where it is. So going up as high as you can will eliminate that unnecessary pause and analysis you might have to do. Now, the thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention today that a lot of people aren't thinking, and things that we are changing at SafeDefend, okay, is going beyond extremity type wounds and bleeding. Okay, certainly it happens, and certainly this is a fantastic way to train and deal with that. But we have to kind of step back and look at, okay, well, when you're looking at emergency medicine, much of the emergency medicine that's taught comes from what we have learned over the many years of combat that the U.S. has been in, the combat medicine. And combat medicine is absolutely incredible, and it is done in the absolute worst environments. And so it's kind of natural that we think, okay, we're going to use the concept of combat medicine in the civilian sector for emergency events like gunshots and things like this. Like, and you kind of look at it, it's like, okay, yeah, well, they do that in the military. We're going to experience that here in the civilian life. So let's apply what we know to that. Well, if you make the assumption, and this is where I'm finding some issues, if you make the assumption that it's always going to be an extremity wound, like a leg or an arm or some sort of a wound like this, we're overlooking the fact that if you're looking at and copying military medicine, okay, in the military, when you have a soldier or a Marine or whoever it is, the military person in combat, most of their bleeding does happen in extremities. Okay. And so it kind of makes sense to, hey, look, if it happens for them, it's going to happen for us. But if we take a step back, and I'm starting to look at cases, I've been talking to some emergency medical people and doctors, and kind of what we're looking at here is that a lot of the civilian shootings and active shooter attacks or active killer attacks with knives, we're not seeing the number of extremity type wounds. We're seeing much more head and torso. And so the question is, well, why is it different than the military? Because you figure that would be the same. But what we forget is it's a different environment. First off, the military usually have helmets on. Okay. They also usually have some sort of protective gear on to protect them. And they understand running for cover, right? And running for concealment. So if they've got a helmet on and they've got all the protective gear on their torso and their chest, and they're running for cover, and you got a bad guy with an AK-47 shooting, they're going to get hit, but a lot of the damage is going to be in the unprotected areas, which is their extremities. And so I see that as an issue if we don't start to look at that beyond just the tourniquet and stuffing the wound and things like this for the extremities, and also start to look at the fact that what I'm seeing in terms of numbers, I haven't confirmed everything, but it seems to me that there are a lot more head wounds and torso wounds in active shooter situations in schools and workplaces than we really are training for. And I think that's something that we need to pivot and include. I don't mean to get rid of anything we're doing on the extremity wounds, but I think we have to start thinking about, well, what do we do for head wounds and torso wounds? Sometimes we can't do anything, right? But sucking chest wounds, there are things you can do and stuff like this. And I know you've had a lot of experience in the military type with that, Dave, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic, as well as wounds to the head, wounds to the torso, and what you've learned in your experience.
Yeah, so this is really easy, folks. It's keep it simple, stupid. The first thing Doc said about putting pressure on the wound, that is it, right? Get something covering it up, get pressure on it, do what you can, and get them to safety as soon as you can, right? That's it. Hemostatic gauze, that's great. Tourniquets, that's great. But the reality of it, you get shot in the chest or the stomach or whatever else, cover it up. Hopefully it went through, right? And minimize damage. So there's 2 holes instead of 1. So you can deal with that. But the reality of it is we were simply taught, we had tons of training. But the one thing my instructor always told me is, look, get pressure on the wound, get the medical professionals there as fast as you can, and deal with it. Sometimes you're not going to be able to save somebody's life. That's the reality of it. But don't make it complicated. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be fun. They're going to be in pain. They're going to be screaming. It's going to be terrifying, right? Prepare yourself emotionally for that and just know, I'm going to get pressure on it until I can get the help there. If you do that one simple thing, you have a better chance of saving their life than anything else we can discuss. And I don't want to complicate this or convolute it, because the reality of it is you're not going to spend the time training to do this because it's not your job, right? So I'm a big fan of keep everything simple, don't complicate things, get pressure on the wound, control the bleeding as much as you can, and get somebody on the phone to get help. The good news is most of these incidents happen in a place where within 10 minutes, you'll have authorities on site, right? It's going to be a long 10 minutes, but 10 minutes isn't impossible. And just a simple action of putting pressure on those wounds and holding it until help gets there could be the difference between life and death.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, we can talk about how to deal with a sucking chest wound. We can teach that in the school environment, but I don't want to confuse anybody. I don't want to scare anybody. Just get pressure on it, stop it for right now, and get help.
Okay. That's
all.
all.
The other thing you mentioned, the other thing today is, and we need to talk about this, right? In a mass casualty event where people are running down the halls, if one of your friends or fellow teachers or a student that you care about gets injured and gunfire is going off, as much as you're going to want to stop and help them, you need to get yourself to safety first. Once the fire shooting is stopped, then you can deal with the people that are injured in the line of fire. Do not go back out there into the line of fire to save them. You risk hurting yourself. You're not trained on how to deal with that.
Yes, and the other thing I'd like to add on that before we close is that if you try to stop to help someone, so let's say you're barricaded and you've got someone who's been shot, and the situation changes and you get an opportunity to take your class or your coworkers, everybody's in the room with you, to escape and get away from that. And this is one of those dilemmas, right? The injured person, you're going to have to let them know that we'll be back to help you, but you can't take them with you or try to stay with them, because here's what happens. If the shooter comes in or comes in near you, you're not only going to lose your friend, you're going to lose yourself and everyone else that you're trying to help and save. And it's just one of those horrible situations to be in. It's a terrible dilemma to be in. Rather you're running over people who are injured as you're trying to escape, or you're locked down, you've been trying to help someone best you can, and now you have an opportunity to escape with everybody. You've got to do that first, and then make sure you just do your best to notify and get help back to that injured person once everyone's safe and it's been cleared by law enforcement.
That's fact. This stuff is not fun, but it's really important. You need to keep a cool head. You need to stay as calm as you can. You got to deal with what you got to deal with. That's what happens when a mass casualty event happens. You have to deal with what you have to deal with, and the best way to do that is to not freak out, take a deep breath, and step through your steps of getting to the safe corner, evading, evacuating, and at last ditch effort, confronting if that's all that's left to survive. So. We are here for you. If you have questions, reach out to Doc Vecchi, reach out to me, reach out to the entire SafeDefend team. We care about you, and we want to see you be safe and successful. So with that, Doc and Dave, we are out of here.
Have a great weekend.